My name is Major Diana Burton, 35 years old, an officer in the United States Army. I was trained to face the enemy anywhere. But I was never prepared for the attack that came right at my own family dinner table. My father, Kenneth, threw his fork down, creating a jarring clang. He roared, each word a bullet aimed straight at me and my 12-year-old son. "You and your kid are just a couple of freeloaders." My mother didn't stop him. She just smiled coldly and nodded. And here's the cruelest truth. They said those words while living rent-free in the very house I bought with my own blood and sweat. I didn't cry. I didn't scream back. I just looked them straight in the eye and said one sentence that left the entire room frozen. From that moment, everything began to crumble. Why did I have to face my parents like this? What drove our relationship to fracture so deeply it may never heal? Before I share my story, let me know where you're watching from. Hit the like button and subscribe. This story is for anyone who has ever had to draw an impossible line in the sand with the very people who brought them into this world. After my father's words hit the table, the air in the room vanished. It was like a vacuum seal, sucking out all sound, all warmth, all oxygen. The scent of pot roast and gravy evaporated, replaced by something sterile and metallic. Across from me, my son Leo stopped breathing. His fork was frozen halfway to his mouth, and his wide eyes locked onto mine, searching not for comfort, but for an order. Beneath the table, I felt his small hand find mine, his fingers squeezing with a desperate strength. I could see the slight, telltale tremble in his shoulders, the tremor of a brave boy trying to stand his ground in an ambush he couldn't understand. That sight, the sight of my son being forced to brace for impact from his own grandparents, was the signal. The line had been crossed. My mother, Eleanor, broke the dead silence. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her iced tea. The crystal glass clicked against her teeth, a sharp, dry cack that was louder than a gunshot in the stillness. A smug, victorious smile remained plastered on her face, the look of a predator who had successfully cornered her prey and was now savoring the kill. She believed she had me pinned, that this public humiliation in front of my own child was the final, breaking blow. My father, Kenneth, stood panting over the table, his chest heaving like a bull after a charge. His face was a mask of crimson rage. He was waiting for the usual reaction, the one he had engineered and perfected over decades of psychological warfare. He was waiting for my tears, waiting for me to beg, to plead, to dissolve into the helpless little girl who could be controlled by his anger and her mother's silent approval. They were both feasting on this moment, this ugly, triumphant second where they believed they had finally, completely broken me. But they weren't looking at a little girl anymore. They were looking at a major in the United States Army. In that instant, a switch flipped in my mind. It was a feeling I knew well from my training, the moment where personal emotion becomes a liability. The storm of feelings inside me, the searing pain, the white-hot rage, the deep, bitter shame, didn't just disappear. They were compressed. All that chaotic energy was forged, under extreme pressure, into a single point of cold, hard clarity. I no longer saw them as my parents. I saw them as two hostile actors who had breached my perimeter and posed a direct threat to the security of my unit. And my unit, my entire world, was the trembling boy sitting next to me. I rose from my chair. My movements were not rushed or angry. They were economical, precise, and deliberate, the way a soldier moves when they know exactly what they need to do next. I smoothed the front of my simple cotton t-shirt, my hands performing the motion automatically, as if I were straightening the lapels of my dress uniform before an inspection. I let my eyes sweep across the room, meeting my father's gaze first, then my mother's. My stare was level and unflinching, devoid of the emotion they craved. It was a commander's gaze, assessing a tactical situation. When I spoke, my voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was calm, measured, and carried a weight that filled every corner of the room, leaving no space for argument or negotiation. In the Army, we have a term for personnel who occupy a base without authorization. Invaders, I said, letting the word hang in the air between us. I paused, watching the confusion cloud their faces before I delivered the final payload. And in this house, I am the commanding officer. I let that sink in for a beat. 1 second, 2. Kenneth, Eleanor, I said, using their first names to formally strip them of their parental rank. You are no longer family staying as guests. As of this moment, you are tenants in breach of contract. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. The aftermath was instantaneous. The color drained from my father's face, his flushed anger replaced by a pasty, chalk-white shock. My mother's victorious smile froze, then cracked and fell from her face as if it were made of cheap porcelain. You? What did you say? She stammered, her voice a pathetic squeak. But I didn't answer her. The order had been given. The discussion was over. I gently placed my hand on Leo's shoulder. His trembling had stopped. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with awe. Let's go, soldier. To your room, I said softly. I guided my son out of the dining room, my back perfectly straight, my head held high. I did not look back at the chaos I left in my wake, at the stunned disbelief, the sputtering rage that was beginning to find its voice. As we walked down the hall, my mother's voice erupted into a full-blown shriek, a torrent of accusations and threats. But to me, it was just noise. The irrelevant, fading sound from a battle that was already over. A battle I had just won. Safely inside Leo's room, I closed the door, shutting out the noise. He finally let go of my hand and wrapped his arms around my waist, burying his face in my shirt. I held him tightly, stroking his hair, my own heart pounding with the adrenaline of the fight. As I stood there, looking at the superhero posters on his wall, a single, heavy question settled in my mind. Why had I let it go on for this long? The question echoed in the quiet of Leo's bedroom, a ghost that had haunted me for 17 years. Why had I let it go on for this long? My eyes drifted from my son's sleeping form to the wall of my own bedroom. There, in a simple black frame, was my commission certificate, promoting me to the rank of major. It was a testament to a life built on discipline and merit. But my gaze didn't linger there. It slid to a smaller, older frame on my nightstand. It held a faded photograph of a smiling girl with a gap-toothed grin, standing next to a tall, proud man in the dress blue uniform of the United States Marine Corps, my grandfather. And looking at his kind, steady eyes, the memory of the first great betrayal came rushing back, as clear and as sharp as the day it happened. 17 years ago, I was 18 years old, and the world was a map of infinite possibility spread at my feet. In my hands, I held a thick, crisp acceptance letter from Vanderbilt University. It wasn't just paper, it was a promise. It was a ticket out of our small Kentucky town, a guarantee of a life that was bigger, brighter, and entirely my own. The foundation for that promise was a sum of $100,000, left to me by my grandfather. He was a tough old Marine who had seen combat in Vietnam, and his love was as fierce and unwavering as his patriotism. In his will, the language was precise, a final, loving command. For my little warrior's education. I remember sitting on the hardwood floor of my bedroom, surrounded by a sea of college brochures and financial aid forms, just weeping with pure, unadulterated happiness. He had always seen me, truly seen me, in a way my parents never could. To them, my older brother Philip was the sun, the center of their universe around which everything and everyone else was expected to orbit. I was just a satellite, a secondary concern. But to my grandfather, I was a warrior. He was the one who taught me about honor, integrity, and self-worth. Never let anyone price you lower than your actual worth, Diana, he used to say, his voice a low, comforting rumble. That money wasn't just a number in a bank account. It was his faith in me, made tangible. That faith was about to be put to the test. A few weeks later, my mother's voice cut through my bedroom door. Family meeting, she said. It wasn't a request. In our house, those words were a summons you didn't refuse. I walked into the living room to a staged scene. My father and mother were seated together on the floral sofa, a united front. Philip was sprawled in the big leather armchair, the one my grandfather used to sit in. An infuriatingly smug look on his face. There was no small talk, no gentle lead-in. My father, a man who treated family life like a business negotiation, got straight to the point. Philip has an excellent business idea, he announced, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He needs capital to get it started. The family's going to invest $100,000 in the venture. The air froze. I could feel the blood drain from my face. But that's Grandpa's money for my college education, I whispered, the words barely audible. My mother slid to the edge of the sofa and reached for me, stroking my hair with a touch that felt like a spider's web. Her voice was syrupy sweet, a tone she reserved for manipulation. Honey, Philip is a man. He needs to build a career, she cooed. You can take out student loans. Everybody does it. Don't be so selfish. This is for the family. Selfish. The word was a slap. My dream, my grandfather's legacy, was being dismissed as selfishness. I tried to fight back. I was 18, but I wasn't stupid. I talked about the will, about my grandfather's specific instructions. I talked about my dreams of becoming an engineer, about the life I was trying to build. I pleaded with them to see how profoundly unfair it was. It was like throwing pebbles against a fortress. Every argument I made was deflected by the cold, hard walls of family duty, sacrifice, and the one that stung the most, you're a girl. My father's patience, always a finite resource, finally snapped. Enough, he barked, his voice cracking like a whip. You will sign the papers at the bank tomorrow morning. End of discussion. That night, sleep was impossible. I just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the future I had so carefully planned being dismantled, brick by brick. The next morning, at the bank, I felt like I was floating outside my own body. I signed my name on the fund transfer document, the pen feeling alien and heavy in my hand. It felt like I was signing away my own soul. I remember the bank teller, a cheerful woman with a bright smile, congratulating us on our exciting family business venture. I just wanted to throw up. Philip's brilliant idea, the one worth sacrificing my future for, was a plan to import cheap, knockoff scooters from China. It went bankrupt in 6 months. Every single penny of my grandfather's legacy vanished along with it. But the loss of the money wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what came next. The silence. It was the way they all acted as if it had never happened. The money, my dreams, the betrayal. It was all erased from the official family history. A few months later, broke and desperate, I cautiously asked when they might be able to start paying back even a small portion, just so I could afford to enroll in community college. My father, who was reading the newspaper, slammed it down on the kitchen table. Are you obsessed with money? He roared, his face turning red. It failed. It's over. Don't you ever bring it up again? My mother tried to smooth things over with her own brand of toxic balm. Money tears families apart, honey, she said, patting my arm. Let's just forget all about it. And just like that, they gave their final order. They hadn't just stolen my money, they had stolen my future. And then, they commanded me to forget the crime had ever taken place. That was the first blood debt. And it was a debt that would never, ever be repaid. After my future was liquidated and the crime erased from my family's history, I was left adrift in a sea of silent resentment. For weeks, I walked around in a fog of helplessness, the ghost of my grandfather's disappointment weighing on me. The final, desperate question of, what now, hung in the air, unanswered. Then one day, walking through downtown Louisville, a poster in a window caught my eye. It was simple, direct, and powerful. A picture of a determined-looking soldier and 3 words, be all you can be. That night, a decision formed in the wreckage of my old dreams. It was time to stop being a victim. It was time to build something no one could ever take from me again. The next day, when I pushed open the glass door to the United States Army recruitment office, I was nothing. A zero. I had no money, no plan, and nothing to my name but a quiet, simmering rage and the clothes on my back. I was just another lost kid looking for a way out. The man behind the desk, a recruiting sergeant named Reyes, was a sturdy, solid-looking black man with kind eyes but a no-nonsense demeanor. He looked me up and down, taking in my worn jeans and the desperate energy I was probably radiating. "Why do you want to join the army?" he asked, his voice calm and even. I had a whole lifetime of answers I could have given him. I could have told him about the stolen inheritance, the shattered dream of Vanderbilt, the profound betrayal that had hollowed me out. But I didn't. I met his gaze and gave him the only truth that mattered now. "I want to serve," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "And I want to build a life that no one can ever take away from me." Sergeant Reyes held my gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. A small, knowing smile touched the corner of his lips. "Welcome to the army, kid," he said. And for the first time in months, I felt like someone had actually seen me, not for what I had or what they could get from me, but for what I could become. If the recruitment office was a doorway, then basic training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, was a full-blown trial by fire. It was 9 weeks of relentless, soul-crushing, beautiful misery. They stripped me of everything that made me an individual. My name became private, my hair was cut short, my civilian clothes were packed away, and my fragile ego was systematically dismantled by the constant screaming attention of the drill sergeants. We marched for miles under the blistering South Carolina sun until our feet were a mass of blisters. We crawled through thick, foul-smelling mud with barbed wire just inches above our heads. We learned to assemble, fire, and clean a rifle until it felt like an extension of our own bodies. Many nights, I'd lie on my top bunk, the thin mattress doing nothing to cushion the ache in my bones, and I'd just stare into the darkness, wondering what in God's name I had done. The physical pain was immense, but the mental exhaustion was worse. I was more alone than I had ever been in my life. One night, about 3 weeks in, I hit a wall. Every muscle screamed, I was sleep-deprived, and a drill sergeant had spent 20 minutes yelling at me because of a loose thread on my uniform. I buried my face in my pillow to muffle the sound of my ragged sobs, convinced I couldn't take another day. It was the closest I ever came to quitting. My fingers fumbled in my wallet, tucked deep inside my footlocker, until they found the small, worn photograph of my grandfather. In the faint moonlight from the barracks window, I looked at his proud, smiling face, and I could almost hear his voice, as clear as day, rumbling in my memory. "Stand tall, warrior. Storms only make oak trees stronger." Something inside me clicked into place. The next morning, when the bugle call blared at 4 a.m., I swung my feet onto the cold floor with a new sense of resolve. This hardship, this discipline, it wasn't breaking me, it was forging me. It was taking all the broken, fragmented pieces of the girl I used to be and melting them down, hammering them into something new, something stronger. With every obstacle course I conquered, every march I finished, I felt like I was reclaiming a piece of myself that had been stolen. After graduation, I was stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The Army gave me what my family never had: a clear mission, a steady paycheck, and a roof over my head. Most importantly, it gave me a path forward. I hadn't forgotten my dream of a college education. I immediately enrolled in evening classes, taking full advantage of the Army's tuition assistance program. My life became a cycle of duty, training, and studying. I read textbooks in the back of Humvees, wrote papers in the noisy mess hall, and squeezed in study sessions whenever and wherever I could. For the first time in my life, I was part of a real team. My squad was a motley crew of kids from every corner of the country: a farm boy from Iowa, a wisecracking kid from the Bronx, a quiet girl from California. They didn't care who my family was or where I came from. They only cared if I could do my job, if I had their back in a firefight. This was a new kind of family, one built not on hollow words and manipulative obligation, but on the solid bedrock of shared hardship and earned trust. Occasionally, the calls from my past would find me. My parents or Philip would phone, always following the same predictable script. It started with a few superficial questions about my well-being, but they were just a prelude to the real reason for the call. Philip was in some kind of trouble again, and they needed money. "Just a little something to help out, Diana. Your Army salary must be pretty good now," my mother would say, her voice dripping with that familiar false sweetness. In the Army, I was learning how to fight. In those phone calls, I learned how to defend myself. I learned how to say no. It was just a single word, but it was the hardest one I ever had to master. Each time I said it, the accusations would fly. I was ungrateful. I was selfish. I had forgotten where I came from. But the words, which once had the power to shatter me, now felt like pebbles bouncing off armor. They didn't have the same weight anymore. Because I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my worth was no longer theirs to define. It wasn't determined by their approval or their disappointment. It was measured by the rank on my uniform and the respect I saw in the eyes of my fellow soldiers. I hung up the phone, the dial tone buzzing in my ear like an angry hornet. The familiar wave of exhaustion washed over me, the same tired, heavy feeling that always followed a conversation with my mother. I took a long sip of my coffee, the bitter warmth a small comfort. Across the little table in the corner of the bustling coffee shop just outside of Fort Bragg, my friend Sarah Jenkins watched me, her expression unreadable. She didn't have to ask. She could see it on my face. "Let me guess," she said, stirring her own drink. "Another crisis in the Philip Burton saga, and they're requesting immediate financial reinforcements?" I managed a weak smile. "You know the script as well as I do," I said, the frustration still thick in my voice. "It's like they think my army paycheck gets deposited directly into his bank account." Sarah just shook her head, a flash of protective anger in her eyes. It was that look, right there, that summed up everything. It was a look I'd never once received from my own family. It was the look of a true ally. I first met Sergeant Sarah Jenkins during an advanced logistics course at Fort Lee, Virginia. She was whip-smart, brutally honest, and had a laugh so loud and genuine it could probably shatter glass. In a world of rigid protocol and serious faces, she was a burst of chaotic, wonderful energy. We bonded instantly, spending long nights studying complex tactical manuals and surviving on stale coffee and sheer willpower. In the suffocating, high-pressure environment of that training, her friendship was a lifeline. She was the first person I ever told the whole story about the $100,000. I remember sitting in the barracks late one night, the words tumbling out of me in a hushed, shameful whisper. I was braced for the usual reaction. Pity, maybe a little awkward sympathy. But Sarah didn't give me either. She just listened, her gaze fixed on mine, and when I finished, her eyes were practically on fire. "The bastards," she said, her voice low and fierce. "Diana, they didn't steal your money. They deserted their post. They went AWOL on their duties as parents." Hearing her frame it in military terms, the language of duty and desertion, was like a key turning in a lock I didn't even know existed. She didn't see me as a victim. She saw me as a soldier whose command structure had failed her. She saw it as a betrayal of the highest order. In that moment, something inside me was set free. Sarah didn't just become a friend, she became my family. A few years later, when I found out I was pregnant with Leo, I was terrified. The father, another soldier I'd been seeing, couldn't handle the news and disappeared from my life, re-enlisting for a post in Germany. I was alone, facing the prospect of being a single mother in the demanding world of the military. But Sarah was there. She drove me to my prenatal appointments when morning sickness made me too dizzy to see straight. She was the one who helped me awkwardly assemble Leo's crib, patiently deciphering the cryptic instructions. And when Leo was born, she was the first person, after me, to hold him. My own family in Louisville never once visited. They sent a generic congratulations card, signed by all three of them. But Sarah? She became Aunt Sarah. The one who showed up for every t-ball game and school play, her cheer the loudest in the crowd. She gave me and my son the one thing my blood relatives never could. She showed up. The year I was promoted to first lieutenant was a quiet milestone. I didn't even think to call my parents. What would I have said? They wouldn't have understood the significance, the long hours and hard work it represented. Instead, I went out with Sarah and a few guys from my platoon to a small, loud, sticky-floored bar in Fayetteville. We ordered a round of cheap beer, and Sarah raised her bottle. "To Lieutenant Burton," she yelled over the music. The guys all cheered and clinked their bottles against mine. In that noisy, unremarkable bar, surrounded by the people who had my back, I felt it for the first time. The warmth of a real family. After years of living frugally, saving every spare dollar, I finally did something I once thought was impossible. I bought my first house. It was a small, modest 3-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood not far from the base, with a little backyard perfect for a kid to run around in. The day I closed the deal and the realtor handed me the keys, I walked into the empty living room, the smell of fresh paint in the air, and I just cried. These walls weren't just drywall and wood studs. They were a symbol of my independence. This was my fortress, built not with an inheritance, but with my own sweat and sacrifice. This was a place no one could ever kick me out of. Sarah and the guys came over that weekend to help me move, and we all sat on the floor, eating pizza out of greasy cardboard boxes and laughing until our sides hurt. That night, feeling a foolish flicker of hope, I called my mother to share the good news. Her reaction was lukewarm at best. "Oh, that's nice, dear," she said, her voice distant and disinterested. Then, without missing a beat, she added, "Just be sure to keep the spare room free. You never know when Philip might need a place to stay for a while." As my career progressed and my finances became more stable, the calls for money became more frequent and more demanding. It was Sarah, who had since left the army and become a brilliant financial advisor, who finally gave me the strategy I needed. We were sitting in my new living room, and she laid it out for me in terms I could understand. "Diana, you have to think of your finances as a defensive perimeter," she said, her tone serious. "Your core unit is you and Leo. Every dollar you send them is a breach in that perimeter. It weakens your defenses and jeopardizes the security of your unit." She helped me set up a rock-solid financial plan, complete with firm, non-negotiable boundaries. She gave me the clarity I desperately needed. If you've ever had a friend who became the family you needed, do me a favor and hit that like button to honor them. And in the comments, just type, "chosen family," if you know exactly what that feels like. Her final piece of advice that day has stayed with me ever since. "Your loyalty belongs to the people in the foxhole with you," she said, looking me straight in the eye. "Not to the ones shooting you in the back." The life I had built was orderly and predictable, governed by the disciplined rhythm of military life. For a time, there was peace. But I had forgotten a fundamental rule of warfare. A determined enemy will always look for a new way to breach your defenses. The attack came when I was half a world away, serving a 6-month deployment in Germany. It was just after midnight, and I was fast asleep in my Spartan room on the base. The sudden, shrill ring of my personal cell phone jolted me awake. My heart instantly seized in my chest. It was my mother. She never called at this hour, not with the 6-hour time difference, unless it was the kind of emergency that every soldier stationed overseas dreads. I fumbled for the phone, my mind already racing through a dozen worst-case scenarios. "Mom, what is it? What's wrong?" "Diana," she sobbed, her voice a mess of panic and ragged breaths. "It's your father. He had a heart attack. The doctors say—" "Oh God, Diana, they say it's very bad." In that single terrifying moment, every wall I had so carefully constructed around my heart came crashing down. The years of resentment, the carefully maintained distance, the hard-won emotional armor, it all dissolved. He was still my father. A wave of guilt and fear washed over me. "I'm coming home," I said immediately, my mind already calculating the logistics of getting emergency leave from my commanding officer. "I'll get the first flight I can." "No!" she cut me off. And just like that, her voice shifted. The panicked, trembling sobs vanished, replaced by a chilling, sudden clarity. "No, don't come home. We don't need you here. We need money." The change in her tone was so abrupt, it was like being doused with a bucket of ice water. It stopped my heart cold. The performance was over, and the real reason for the call was revealed. She started talking, the words spilling out in a frantic, desperate rush. The story wasn't about a heart attack. It was about money. It was always about money. My father, in his infinite wisdom, had used their house in Louisville as collateral to fund yet another one of Philip's brilliant, can't-miss business ventures. And, like every venture before it, it had failed spectacularly. Now they were $300,000 in debt, and the bank was moving to foreclose on the house. The heart attack, she admitted, was actually a minor bout of angina, brought on by the stress of their own catastrophic decisions. The entire midnight call, the frantic tears, the story of my father on death's door. It was all a calculated, theatrical lie, designed to short-circuit my defenses and trigger an immediate, emotional response. When I tried to ask for more details about my father's actual medical condition, she cut me off with a wave of dismissive irritation. "You're a soldier, not a doctor. What would you know?" she snapped. "Your job is to worry about the money." There it was. My entire existence, my career, my intelligence, all of it reduced to a single function, an ATM. "You're our only hope, Diana," she started crying again, the performance resuming now that the facts were on the table. "You can't let your father and me be thrown out on the street at our age. After everything we've done for you, it's your duty to help us." Duty? That word again. The heavy invisible chain they always tried to lock around my neck. My training kicked in, overriding the emotional chaos. "I need some time to think about this," I said, my voice flat. It was a tactical mistake. Saying I needed time didn't give me space, it gave them an opening. It was the signal for them to launch a full-scale psychological assault. Within hours, my phone started buzzing with incoming fire. Philip began a relentless barrage of text messages, each one dripping with venom. I was a heartless daughter, a traitor. I was letting Dad die because of my selfishness. Then came the email from my father himself. The man who was supposedly on his deathbed had apparently found the strength to type out a 2,000-word manifesto. It contained not a single word of affection or a question about my own life. It was a long, rambling, self-pitying analysis of how this entire financial disaster was, in fact, my fault. If only I had been a more supportive daughter and invested in Philip's genius from the start, none of this would have happened. They were coordinating their attack, hitting me from all sides in a classic pincer movement. My brother with the emotional artillery, my father with the gaslighting, and my mother with the tearful pleas. They weren't asking for help. They were issuing a demand for my unconditional surrender. And it was working. Thousands of miles away, isolated in my room, I felt myself starting to break. The weight of being their only hope was crushing, a burden designed to be unbearable. My resolve began to crumble under the relentless assault. My hand was shaking as I dialed Sarah's number. "What do I do?" I asked, my voice cracking. The carefully controlled officer disappearing, replaced by a lost and overwhelmed daughter. Sarah was quiet on the other end for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was as steady and as solid as steel. "Major," she said, and the use of my rank was deliberate, a reminder of who I was. "This is an ambush. They are using faulty intelligence and emotional warfare to lure you into a trap. You cannot fight this battle from a distance. You have to go back. You have to confront them on your territory, under your terms, and gather your own, actual intelligence." Her words were like a splash of cold water to the face, snapping me out of the emotional fog. She was right. I couldn't make a sound decision based on their panic and their manipulation. I was letting the enemy dictate the terms of engagement. That had to stop. I took a deep breath, the steel returning to my own voice. I knew what I had to do. I was going home. I submitted the request for emergency leave the next morning. But my mission wasn't to fly back and rescue them. It was to fly back and end this war, once and for all. The flight from Germany to Louisville was a long, suffocating journey through time zones and recycled air. With every hour that passed, the cold, analytical clarity I'd felt after talking to Sarah began to fray, replaced by a familiar, heavy dread. As I drove the rental car from the airport, the familiar suburban streets of my hometown, lined with oak trees and quiet houses, felt alien. I wasn't coming home to a sanctuary. I was a soldier entering a known combat zone. My own house, the fortress I had built for myself and my son, now felt like enemy-occupied territory. I pulled into the driveway and took a deep breath before killing the engine. I had spent years in the Army learning about survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. SEER training teaches you to identify your absolute breaking point, your non-negotiable red line, the thing you will protect at all costs. I knew what mine was. It was Leo. When I walked through the door, the rich smell of pot roast filled the air, a scent that should have meant comfort and homecoming. But the atmosphere in the house was cold, tense, and unnaturally quiet. My mother, father, and Philip were all sitting in the living room, their faces turned towards the door as I entered. They looked like a parole board waiting for a prisoner. There were no hugs, no welcoming smiles. I was still numb and stiff from the 10-hour flight, my body aching with jet lag. But no one asked if I was tired. No one offered me a glass of water. My mother's first words to me before I'd even put my bags down were, "Did you talk to the bank yet?" The question hung in the air, a perfect encapsulation of their entire worldview. I wasn't their daughter who had just traveled 4,000 miles. I was a financial instrument that had just arrived to perform its function. "We need to talk about the plan," she continued, her tone all business. "I've drafted a list of the required payments and a potential schedule." She had a battle plan for my money, and I was expected to execute it without question. Dinner was not a family reunion. It was an interrogation. The pot roast sat heavy in my stomach as they launched a coordinated attack, each of them taking turns hammering at my defenses. My father lectured me about family honor and the shame of losing their home, a home he hadn't made a payment on in years. My mother talked about a child's responsibility, her voice laced with the tearful guilt she had perfected into an art form. Philip, my golden boy brother, just whined. He rambled on about missed opportunities and blamed the state of the economy for his own incompetence, all while shoveling food into his mouth. They never once asked about my life in Germany. They didn't ask about my work, my soldiers, or how Leo was handling me being deployed. When I finally found a gap in their wall of demands, I tried to steer the conversation back to reality. "I have my own responsibilities," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "I have to provide for Leo's future. His college fund is my priority." My father scoffed, waving his hand in a dismissive gesture. "What's to provide for? He's a boy, he'll manage on his own eventually," he said with a cruel, casual logic. "The family needs you now." The unspoken words hung in the air. Your son's future is less important than your brother's failures. The injustice of it was breathtaking. I took a deep, steadying breath, preparing to draw the line. "I will not," I said, each word chosen with deliberate care, "be using the money I have saved for Leo's education to pay off Philip's debts." It was a clear, unambiguous declaration. And it was the detonator. "You selfish bitch!" Philip spat, his face contorting with rage. My mother, right on cue, burst into theatrical sobs, burying her face in her hands. It was a familiar performance, designed to paint me as the cruel aggressor. And then came the final escalation. My father, Kenneth, shot to his feet. His face was a terrifying shade of crimson, a vein pulsing in his temple. He slammed his fork down on the table, the sharp clang making me flinch. "You and your kid are just a couple of freeloaders," he roared, the voice of a man whose authority had been challenged and found wanting. He leaned over the table, his eyes bulging. "Living in my house, eating my food, and you refuse to help the family that raised you." The sheer, staggering audacity of the lie almost knocked the wind out of me. His house, his food. I owned this house, every single stud, every shingle on the roof. I paid the mortgage, I paid the property taxes. I'd even stopped at the Kroger on my way from the airport to buy the ingredients for this very meal. And that was it. That was the red line. He hadn't just insulted me. He hadn't just lied. He had aimed his poison directly at my son. The part of me that had spent 17 years silently absorbing their toxicity, the part that had learned to endure and retreat, simply died. It was replaced by the major. 17 years of suppressed rage did not come out as a scream. It came out as ice. I stood up slowly, my movements calm and controlled. I faced him, my eyes locked on his. The words that I had buried for nearly 2 decades finally came out, not in a shout, but in a cold, clear, and final declaration. In the Army, We have a term for personnel who occupy a base without authorization. Invaders, I said, my voice steady and quiet, cutting through the drama in the room. And in this house, I am the commanding officer. I paused, letting the words land with the full weight of their meaning. Kenneth, Eleanor, I continued, formally dismissing them as my parents. You are no longer family staying as guests. As of this moment, you are tenants in breach of contract. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. That was the moment the war truly began. If you have ever felt that incredible, terrifying release of finally standing up for yourself, hit the like button right now. And in the comments below, I want you to write just one word: boundary. Because that's a word we all need to learn how to use. The silence that followed my declaration at the dinner table was heavier than any of the shouting that had come before it. It was the stunned, ringing silence of a battlefield after a bomb has gone off. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. I simply took Leo upstairs, tucked him into bed, and closed the door on the life I used to have. Sleep didn't come. Instead, I spent the night staring at the ceiling, my mind calm and clear for the first time in years. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind the cold, hard certainty of a mission objective. I was no longer a victim. I was a commander. The next morning, while the sun was just beginning to stream through the window, I initiated my counteroffensive. My first call was to my ally, my second-in-command, Sarah. They've declared war, I said, my voice low and steady as I paced the spare bedroom. And they've just opened a new front. What happened? Sarah asked, her voice instantly alert. I explained the scene at dinner, the ultimatum I had given them. Then I told her about the newest development. Mom has gone public. She posted a tearful video on TikTok and Facebook. She's telling everyone her heartless major daughter is throwing her and her sick, elderly husband out on the street. It's already getting hundreds of views in the local community. Sarah didn't gasp or offer sympathy. She reacted like the NCO she was. Okay, Major, information warfare. We've been trained for this, she said, her voice sharp and strategic. Rule number 1, you do not engage the enemy on their turf. Do not reply, do not comment, do not post a response. You let them scream into the void while we move on the real objective. What is the mission? That single question focused everything. We turned the phone call into a war council. I was the commanding officer, and Sarah was my strategic advisor. I laid out the primary objective: neutralize their main weapon, the leverage they have over my house, and regain total, uncontested control of the situation. Sarah, in her role as a financial advisor, immediately started pulling up data on her end. Okay, she said after a few moments of typing. Let's assess the battlefield. I could hear her clicking away, analyzing the financial intelligence. There was a long pause on her end of the line, and then she spoke again, a new excitement in her voice. Wait a minute, she said slowly. I have an idea. It's a little crazy, but it might just work. She explained that the $300,000 debt my parents were in wasn't on my house, as I had assumed. It was a second mortgage they had taken out on their own old house in Louisville, the one they had owned for 30 years. The house was on the verge of being foreclosed on by the bank. My mother's plan was to emotionally blackmail me into giving them the money to pay off their own catastrophic mistake. So instead of giving them the money to bail them out, Sarah said, the idea taking shape, why don't you go on the offensive? You're a veteran. You have access to a VA loan with incredible terms. Why don't we just buy the house out from under them? We can approach the bank directly and offer to buy the distressed property before it even goes to auction. The idea hit me like a lightning strike. It was brilliant. It was audacious. It wasn't defense. It was a preemptive strike. It would completely disarm them, removing their only real piece of leverage, their impending homelessness, and transferring all power and control directly into my hands. Do it, I said without a second's hesitation. From that moment on, I moved with absolute purpose. I was no longer operating from a place of pain or anger. I was executing a mission. I immediately contacted a real estate attorney in Louisville that Sarah recommended, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who specialized in foreclosures. I spent the next hour on the phone with USAA, my military-affiliated bank. and started the pre-approval process for a VA loan. Every step was calculated and precise. While my family was busy performing for their audience on social media, convinced I was cornered and on the verge of surrender, I was silently moving my pieces into position on the board. I created a new folder on my laptop labeled Evidence. I saved screenshots of Philip's abusive text messages. I saved the gaslighting email from my father. I used a screen recorder to capture a perfect, high-quality copy of my mother's tearful TikTok video and the dozens of comments from strangers calling me a monster. I was building a case, documenting every threat and every manipulation. The feeling was strange. The fear and hurt that had plagued me for years were gone, replaced by an intense, diamond-hard focus. The plan moved faster than I could have hoped. My attorney confirmed that Sarah's idea was not only possible, but strategically sound. The bank, she explained, was desperate to get the bad loan off its books and was more than willing to negotiate a quick sale to a pre-approved buyer. It was a clean, simple solution for them. Within 1 week, while my mother's video continued to rack up sympathetic views, my attorney had finalized the paperwork. I signed the documents electronically from my own living room, and just like that, I became the legal owner of my parents' house, the very home they were using as a bargaining chip against me. But I wasn't done. The final phase of the operation was to establish the new rules of engagement. I had my attorney draft a formal, legally binding letter. This was not an emotional plea. It was a tactical document. It clearly stated that I was the new owner of the property and that I was offering them 2 options. Option 1, they could remain in the house as tenants, provided they signed a formal lease agreement and began making monthly payments to me to pay back the $300,000 debt. Option 2, they could vacate the property within 30 days, as per state law. The document also included a cease and desist clause, legally demanding that my mother immediately remove all defamatory content from social media and refrain from any future public statements about our family matter. Any violation of these terms, the letter stated, would result in immediate eviction proceedings. The new rules of the war had been written, and this time, I was the one writing them. The plan was in motion. The legal documents were signed, sealed, and ready. There would be no more phone calls, no more text messages, no more long-distance battles fought from a different continent. This war would be won face-to-face, on my terms. I didn't go alone. My attorney, Mr. Miller, met me in the parking lot of a nearby Starbucks. He was a mid-sized, middle-aged man with a weathered face that looked like it had been carved from granite, but his eyes were sharp, intelligent, and missed nothing. He carried a worn leather briefcase that seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 legal battles. We didn't exchange pleasantries. I was his client. He was my legal counsel. Our relationship was transactional, and in that moment, it was exactly the kind of ally I needed. When we pulled up to the house, their house, the one I now legally owned, my heart was pounding a steady, rhythmic drum against my ribs. It wasn't fear, it was anticipation. We walked up the familiar concrete path and rang the doorbell. My mother answered, a look of annoyance on her face that quickly morphed into suspicion when she saw the stranger in a suit standing beside me. "Diana, who is this?" she asked, her voice edged with hostility. She made no move to let us in. "This is my attorney, Mr. Miller," I said, my voice calm and level. I didn't wait for an invitation. I stepped past her, through the doorway and into the living room. "We need to talk." My father and Philip were slouched on the sofa, watching a basketball game on TV. At the sound of my voice, they both looked up, their expressions shifting from lazy boredom to instant alarm. My father muted the television with the remote, and a heavy, oppressive silence immediately fell over the room. The air grew thick, charged with unspoken questions and years of resentment. They knew this was not a social call. This was an official visit. "What's this all about?" my father demanded, trying to project an authority he no longer had. We all sat down, my parents and Philip on one side, me and Mr. Miller on the other. It felt less like a family gathering and more like a treaty negotiation between 2 warring nations. Mr. Miller, without a single wasted word, placed his briefcase on the coffee table and clicked it open. He withdrew a thick manila folder, and placed it squarely in the center of the table. "Mr. and Mrs. Burton," he began, his voice a flat, dispassionate monotone. "We are here today to discuss the status of this property." My father let out a short, contemptuous laugh. "There's nothing to discuss," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "My daughter is going to take care of everything. She always does." Mr. Miller looked at my father, his face completely devoid of emotion. "Actually, sir," he said, his voice unchanging, "she already has." As of 8 o'clock this morning, Major Burton, through a legal and binding transaction with the bank, became the sole and undisputed owner of this property. The silence that followed was absolute. It was so profound you could hear the faint ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, each second landing like a hammer blow. My mother's face went slack with shock, her mouth opening and closing silently like a fish. You're lying," she finally stammered, pointing a trembling finger at me. Philip, ever the smug antagonist, let out a derisive snort. "Right," he scoffed, leaning back on the sofa with a look of supreme confidence. "And how would you ever pull that off? You think you're someone who can do that?" I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. My inspiration for this moment was General Patton. Never tell people how to do things. Tell them what to do, and they will surprise you with their ingenuity. I had given my team, Sarah and Mr. Miller, their mission, and they had delivered me a victory. Mr. Miller simply reached into the folder and slid a single, notarized document across the smooth surface of the coffee table. It was a certified copy of the new title deed to the house, with my name printed in bold, official lettering at the bottom. Philip, with all the arrogance of a man who had never faced a real consequence in his life, snatched the paper. I watched his face as he read it. It was a slow, beautiful, and devastating transformation. The smug smirk faltered first, replaced by a flicker of confusion. The confusion then melted into stark disbelief, and finally, the disbelief collapsed into pure, wide-eyed panic. He dropped the paper as if it were burning hot, his face turning a sickly shade of pale. "No way," he breathed. "It can't be." My father ripped the deed from the table, his eyes darting across the legal text, searching for a loophole, a mistake, anything to deny the reality staring him in the face. But there was none. It was all there in black and white. Checkmate. Mr. Miller pressed his advantage, his voice cutting through their stunned silence. "As such," he continued, his tone as unforgiving as a judge's gavel, "Major Burton is presenting you with two options. Option 1, you can sign this lease agreement and remain in the house as her tenants, at which point you will begin making monthly payments toward the $300,000 debt you now owe her." He slid a second document, a thick, standard rental agreement, across the table. Option 2, you can vacate the premises within 30 days, as is your right under state law. If you fail to do so, we will begin formal eviction proceedings. The finality of it all finally seemed to register. The fight drained out of them, replaced by a pathetic, desperate fear. My mother looked at me, her eyes, for the first time in my life, stripped of all their usual contempt and scorn. In their place was the raw, terrified pleading of a defeated enemy. "Diana," she whimpered, her voice cracking. "Diana, please. You can't do this to us. We're your family." But I couldn't hear her anymore. The words were just noise. I had retaken my stronghold. The battle was over. I stood up, my movements feeling light and unburdened. "Mr. Miller," I said, looking at my attorney, "I believe my work here is done. I'll leave the rest to you." I turned my back on the wreckage in the living room and walked out the front door into the bright afternoon sun. And for the first time in my entire life, I felt the indescribable, intoxicating, and absolute sensation of being truly and completely free. The feeling of freedom as I walked out of that house was so pure, so absolute, it was dizzying. But I didn't drive away. I couldn't. I pulled my rental car over at the end of the street, killed the engine, and just sat there in the quiet hum of the afternoon. In my rearview mirror, I could see the house I had just reclaimed, the house where I had once been a daughter and was now a landlord. The lights inside flickered on and off in different rooms, erratic signals of the chaos and confusion I'd left in my wake. I expected to feel triumphant, a surge of righteous victory. But I didn't. What I felt instead was a vast, hollow emptiness. It was the profound, deafening silence that settles over a battlefield after the fighting is done. I had won, yes, but the price of victory was the conscious, deliberate act of destroying the final bridge that connected me to my own past. My phone, sitting in the cup holder, began to buzz incessantly. A relentless series of calls and texts. My mother, my father, Philip. I silenced it without looking. There was nothing left to say. I turned on the car stereo, and the smooth, mournful sound of a Wynton Marsalis trumpet solo filled the car. It was a small pocket of order in the midst of my emotional chaos. As I sat there, another call came through from a number I didn't recognize. An aunt, my mother's cousin from out of state. I hesitated, then answered, bracing for another wave of guilt. "Diana?" she asked, her voice gentle. "It's your Aunt Carol. Your mother called me. I know I only heard one side of the story, dear." She paused. "But I just wanted to call and say that I know you were always a good kid. And whatever is happening, I just hope you find some peace." Tears I didn't even know were there welled in my eyes. That simple, quiet validation from someone on the periphery of my life was something my own parents had never been able to give me. It was a small, unexpected act of grace in the middle of a war. I thought of Abraham Lincoln's famous letter to Mrs. Bixby, mourning the loss of her sons in the Civil War. I realized sitting there in my car that I had just fought my own civil war. I had lost my family. And now, the long, quiet work of healing the wound had to begin. Just as Mr. Miller had predicted, they did not sign the lease agreement. Instead, they launched one final, desperate campaign of manipulation. My mother left a long, rambling voicemail, her voice thick with performative sobs. She claimed she didn't know what she'd done wrong and pleaded with me to remember the bonds of blood. It was a masterpiece of manufactured victimhood. Philip sent a text that, for the first time in his life, actually contained the words, "I'm sorry." But it was immediately followed by, "But you have to try and understand my position." It was an apology that took no responsibility, a classic non-apology. My father, however, was silent. In many ways, his silence was more unnerving than his rage. It was the stunned, impotent silence of a patriarch who had been completely and utterly stripped of his power and had no idea how to function in a world where he was no longer in control. But I had seen these performances too many times before. Their apologies weren't born of remorse for what they had done to me. They were born of terror for what was about to happen to them. Their sorrow wasn't for the pain they had caused, but for the consequences they were finally being forced to face. They weren't sorry for the crime, only for getting caught. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet my mother one last time. We met at a neutral location, a quiet, generic coffee shop halfway between the house and my hotel. There would be no lawyers this time, just the two of us. The woman who walked in looked like a ghost of my mother. She seemed to have aged 10 years in as many days. Her usual defiant posture was gone, replaced by a frail, stooped desperation. She slid into the booth across from me and immediately reached for my hands, her own feeling cold and papery. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swimming with tears. "Diana, please," she whispered, her voice raspy. "Forgive us. We can start over. Just let us stay in the house. We'll try to pay. I promise we'll try." I looked deep into her eyes, searching, really searching, for one flicker of genuine remorse, one sign that she understood the depth of the wound she had inflicted over the decades. But I didn't find it. All I saw was fear. The raw animal fear of losing her home, of losing her comfort, of having her life disrupted. I gently pulled my hands away. When I spoke, my voice was soft, but the words were forged from 17 years of pain. "I forgive you, Mom," I said. And in that moment, I realized it was the absolute truth. The anger had burned away, leaving only a deep, profound sadness. "I forgive you for not being the mother that I needed you to be." Her face brightened with a flicker of hope, but I held up a hand. But forgiveness does not mean reconciliation. It doesn't mean we go back. I cannot allow you back into my life, or into Leo's life, in the same way. The border has been established. It has to be. I was releasing myself from the weight of my own anger, but I was not absolving her of the consequences of her actions. After I left the coffee shop, I sat in my car for a moment and made my final call. "Mr. Miller," I said when he answered, "proceed with the eviction." My voice was steady. It was one of the hardest, most painful decisions of my life, but it was also the cleanest and most necessary. This wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of self-preservation. It was an act of a mother protecting her child's future from the toxicity of her own past. A few weeks later, they were gone. Mr. Miller's office handled the details, and I was kept at a distance. I learned later that Philip had been forced to rent a small one-bedroom apartment across town. My parents had moved into a senior living apartment complex on the outskirts of Louisville. The house was finally mine again. It was quiet. It was peaceful. But the peace was tinged with a melancholy that I knew would take a long time to fade. It was the sadness for a family that could have been, but never was. 1 year later. The Army, in its infinite and often mysterious wisdom, had transferred me to Fort Knox. It was a coincidence, a routine change of station. But the fact that it was only an hour's drive from Louisville felt less like a coincidence and more like a gift from the universe. It was a chance to build a new life in the shadow of my old one, a final test of the borders I had established. My old house, the one I had once called my fortress, was no longer my home. The memories there, both good and bad, were too heavy. I had rented it out to a young sergeant's family, and the thought of their laughter filling those halls brought me a sense of peace. Instead, Leo and I lived on base in officer housing. Our life was now surrounded by the steady, predictable rhythm of the military community, a world built on discipline, mutual respect, and a shared sense of purpose. Every morning, I'd go for a run just as the sun was rising, my feet pounding the pavement past the perfectly manicured lawns and the historic brick buildings of Fort Knox. I'd feel the solid, steady ground beneath me, and I would know, with a certainty that went bone deep, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I was no longer a satellite orbiting a dysfunctional sun. I was my own center of gravity. As the great Maya Angelou once said, "I can be changed by what happens to me, but I refuse to be reduced by it." I had not been reduced by my past. I had been redefined by it. The house in Louisville, the one my parents had lived in, the one that had been the epicenter of so much pain and manipulation, I didn't sell it. For a long time, I didn't know what to do with it. Selling it felt like trying to profit from my own pain, and I couldn't bring myself to do it. The memory of my father's words, "my house," still echoed in the back of my mind. It was a place tainted by selfishness. The only way to cleanse it was to consecrate it with an act of service. After having the entire house repaired and repainted, I partnered with a local nonprofit that worked with veterans. Together, we created something I called the Warrior Project. The house that was once a symbol of my family's greed became a sanctuary. We offered it, free of charge, as a temporary safe harbor for military families who were facing a sudden crisis, a medical emergency, a sudden job loss, a gap in housing. The symbol of their selfishness was transformed into a beacon of hope. Sometimes when I have to drive into Louisville for an appointment, I'll take a small detour and drive past it. I'll see bicycles scattered on the front lawn or hear the faint sound of children laughing in the backyard, and I'll smile. My pain had been converted into someone else's peace. My wound had become someone else's shelter. It was the best kind of victory. I did not sever all ties with my parents. That, I decided, was not an act of honor. I send them a small, modest stipend every month, enough to cover their basic necessities. I do it not out of love, because that well has long run dry, but out of a sense of duty. An officer does not abandon their people, even the ones who have long since been removed from the unit. It's a clean, transactional arrangement. There are no phone calls. There are no visits. The border I established all that time ago remains intact, solid, and unbreachable. They made their choices, and now they, like me, must live with the consequences. My real family, the one I chose and the one that chose me, is stronger than ever. Leo, of course, is my whole world. Sarah is still my best friend, my trusted advisor, and the first person I call with good news or bad. And my soldiers, the men and women I have the profound privilege to lead, have taught me more about loyalty and sacrifice than my own blood ever could. They are the ones who have shown me what a family, a true unit, is supposed to look like. They are the ones in the foxhole with me. My story doesn't end with a dramatic confrontation or a final tearful reunion. It ends on a perfectly ordinary, sun-drenched Saturday afternoon. I'm sitting on a set of metal bleachers, the sun warm on my face, watching Leo's soccer team. They're down by 1, and there are only a few minutes left in the game. Leo gets the ball. He's not the fastest kid on the team, but he's the most determined. I watch him charge down the field, his face a mask of intense concentration, his small legs pumping with everything he's got. He takes the shot. The world seems to move in slow motion as the ball sails through the air, a perfect arc against the bright blue sky. It soars past the goalie's outstretched hands and hits the back of the net. The crowd of parents erupts in cheers. Leo's head whips around, his eyes searching the stands until they find mine. He breaks into a huge, radiant grin and runs towards me, his face flushed with victory and pride. He scrambles up the bleachers and throws his arms around my neck, his whole body trembling with excitement. "Did you see that, Mom?" he yells, his voice breathless. "I did it!" I hug him tight, burying my face in his sweaty hair, the smell of grass and sunshine filling my senses. "I saw it, warrior," I whisper into his ear, my own voice thick with an emotion too big for words. "I always see you." And in that perfect simple moment, holding my son in my arms, I realized that my most important mission, the one I was truly put on this earth to accomplish, was to protect this small, warm, and priceless stronghold. That mission was a success. And that's my story. Not of a war I won, but of a peace I built. My battlefield was a dinner table, but I know so many of you are fighting your own battles every single day with a courage the world needs to see. This channel is a home for stories like ours, stories of resilience and reclaiming our own lives. If you believe in the power of drawing your own boundaries and finding your own peace, I would be honored if you would subscribe and become a part of this community. Please hit the like button if this story gave you hope today. And in the comments, I'd love to see you share one word that represents your fortress, that source of strength that is entirely your own.